Oh hi. Israel, the state in the Middle East. The population for December 31, 2019, card people. The territory minus 22072 km. Takes the 96th place in the world on population, and the 148th in territory. It is located in the Middle East, at east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In the north borders on Lebanon, in the northeast on Syria, in the east on Jordan and territory of the West Bank, in the southwest on Egypt and the Gaza Strip. The capital, Jerusalem a lump. 2. A state language, Hebrew. Arabic has the special status. Unitary state, democratic parliamentary republic. It is subdivided into 6 administrative districts. The industrial country with dynamically developing economy. PDD volume by April 2019 was over $381 billion, $39.16 thousand per capita. In the list of the countries by the Index of Human Development is in the 22nd place in the world. Index 0.903. Monetary unit Israeli new shekel. The Declaration of Independence was proclaimed on May 14, 1948. 5 hour of the 5708th year. A lump. 1 on the basis of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly No. 181 adopted on November 29, 1947. According to the Declaration of Independence, Israel is the Jewish state. At the same time, Israel is the multinational and democratic state where, along with Jews, the equal rights have also all other ethnic groups, regardless of religion. Israel differs in considerable ethnocultural diversity. Main population of the country. Card people, Jews. 74. 1%. Card people, Arabs. 21%. Card people, other. 4.9%. Throughout the last 3 millennia, the word Israel, designated as Earth of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, and all Jewish people. The Genesis where the forefather Jacob after fight good luck receives the name Israel is a source of this name. Also I told, how your name? He told Jacob. Also I told him, from now on the name to you will be not Jacob and Israel because you fought good luck and Shalavik you will overcome. Life 32, 27.28. Interpreters disperse in determination of value of this word. According to one version, this name comes from Sar's verb. To operate, be strong, to have the power given from above. Thus forming the word meaning having the power over forces. Other possible values, Prince Bozi, or fight/battle of God. Subsequently the Jewish people which occurred from Jacob began to be called children of Israel. The people of Israel are Israelis. The mention of the word Israel, first in the history, was revealed on the Neptach stele in the territory of ancient Egypt. The end of the 13th century BB. And belongs to the people, but not to the country. The modern state was called Medinat Israel. State of Israel, in the USSR and in the former Soviet Union, in a wrong-way State of Israel, were considered as well other names. Eretz Israel, Earth of Israel, Zion, Judea. In the first weeks of independence, the government of the new state, for designation of citizens of the country, chose the word Israelis as Israeli. For the first time it was mentioned officially in a speech of the First Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Moshe Shareta. It is known that in the territory of modern Israel the person or the grade which traces of state remained in the territory of an archaeological site of Abidia. Tel Ovadia lived. About 200,000 years ago Neanderthal men lived in this region, and soon also people of modern type appeared after that. The age of bones of Homo sapiens, Nassif Carmel, is 175-200,000 years of Maslia's cave. In 10 the 8th millennia BB this territory was included into an area of Nativiski culture which carriers for the first time in the history began to cultivate cereals. About 9,000 years ago in these parts Neolithic revolution began and pioneer settlements, including the most ancient city of Jericho, appeared. Hanan, the first Semitic tribes, appeared here approximately in 4-3 millennia BB. Following 2-3,000 years the territory was under protectorate of ancient Egypt. Communication of the Jewish people and earth of Israel is built to the Bible patriarch Abraham. According to the Bible, earth of Israel was bequeathed to Jews by God to become land promised. There are all sacred places of the Jewish people. The Bible legend about patriarchs probably reflects migrations Ivri, Haber, in the 2nd millennium BB and events of an era of invasion of Hyksos into Egypt. Abraham's history probably corresponds to the initial stage of migrations Ivri, and Massachusetts resettlement happens about the 13th century BB. Therefore the late Bronze culture of Canaan is replaced new. About 1200 BB on the coast of the country Philistines, to whom there goes back the modern name, Palestine, Git. Establishment at Jews of the imperial power and emergence Israeli, and later and Judaic kingdoms is dated 10th century BB. Since 8th century BB this territory consistently appeared under the power of Assyria, Babylon, the empire of Achaemenid, 539-331 years BB, and Macedonia, since 331 BB. In the 3-2 centuries BB I was a part of the Hellenistic states of Ptolemy and Seleucid. In 142 the power of Seleucid, which is torn apart by civil strife, completely exempted Judea from a tribute, having actually recognized her independence, and further till 37th year BB the Jewish dynasty Hasmonean governed there. Since 63 BB Judea became the vassal of Rome and further was turned into the Roman province of the same name. During the revolt Bar Kokhba in 135 Romans destroyed a great number of Jews, forbade the rest to lodge in Jerusalem and renamed the province of Judea into Syria-Palestinian. After the partition in 395 of the Roman Empire to Western and East Byzantium, Palestine departed to the last. In 614-629 years Palestine was a part of the Persian Empire Sassanid, which for 3 years ceded control over Jerusalem to Jews, but then returned the city to Christians. After return of Palestine under the power of Byzantium, in 630 years as a result of massacre and persecutions on the Jews begun by the Byzantine Emperor Irakli, the Jewish presence in the region reached the minimum for all 3,000-year history, but never stopped completely. By the 9th century the Jewish communities appeared in Jerusalem and Tiberias again, and in the next 2 centuries arose in Rafah, Gaza, Mazdale, Jaffa and Caesarea. In 640 years the Byzantine Palestine was conquered by Arabs. In the next 6 centuries control over this territory passed from Umayyad to Abbasidam, to Crusaders and back. The short Jewish encyclopedia divides the first era of the Arab dominion in Palestine into 4 periods. Gain and development of the country. 638 to 660 years. Dynasties Umayyad. 661-750. Abbasidaf. 750-969. And Fatimidaf. 969-1099. In 1099 Crusaders founded the Jerusalem kingdom here. However in 1187 Salah ad-Din took Jerusalem, and in 1291 the last fortress of Crusaders, the Acre, fell. In 1517 the territory of Israel was won by Ottoman Turks under leadership of the Sultan Selim I. Within 400 years it remained a part of the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire Jews, having the status of zimma, used relative civil and religious liberty, but were exposed to restrictions for a number of types of activity and also were obliged to pay the extraordinary taxes. Means of livelihood Jews of Palestine received mainly in the form of donations. Halk. From abroad at this time. At the beginning of the 18th century one of the most considerable attempts of Elijah of Europe and updating of the Jewish Religious National Center in Jerusalem was undertaken. The Rabbi Yehuda Hatzid, who arrived in Jerusalem in 1700 at the head of about thousands of followers, natives of various countries of Europe, was at the head of this movement. However, Yehuda Hatzid after arrival in the country suddenly died, and the community broke up because of debts. Long time after that the Jewish immigrants from Europe lodged mainly in other saints for Judaism, the cities, Hebron, Sfat and Tiberias. By 1800 no more than 300,000 people lived in Palestine. The main places of concentration of the Christian population, about 25,000, were in Jerusalem, Nazareth and Bethlehem. 5,000 inhabitants were Jews, mainly Sephardic Jews. Other population was made by Muslims, in the majority Sunnites. By 1880 the population of Palestine made 450,000 people. This number included 24,000 Jews who were generally living in Jerusalem. Were made more than a half from his 25,000 population. To Tzfat, 4,000 people. Tiberias, 2.5 thousand people. And also in Hebron, Jaffa and Haifa. Jerusalem became the largest city of the region. Among the Jews living in diaspora the strong aspiration to return to Zion was always widespread. The Jewish community of Palestine was constantly fed with visitors from diaspora who were conducted their religious, including messianic, by motives. The Jewish community of Tzfat, containing by the end of the 16th century of 14,000 people, was formed of the refugees expelled from Spain. The first big wave of modern immigration, known as the First Aliyah, began in 1881. It was headed by the Palestinophile dreaming of return of all Jewish people to the historical homeland. The first Zionist Congress in 1897 to Basel, Switzerland. The founder of political Zionism, the movement setting as the purpose creation of the Jewish state on the earth of Israel, Theodor Herzl is considered. In 1896 Herzl published the book Jewish State, in which I stated the vision of future Jewish state. Next year Herzl directed the First World Jewish Congress. The second Aliyah began in 1904 after the Chisana disorder.
In her course to Palestine of the Prophet of 40,000 Jews, from which a considerable part left the country later, but nevertheless by 1914 the number of the Jewish Yeshuv in Palestine reached 85,000 people.
Most of immigrants of the first and second Aliyah were Orthodox Jews, but together with them in Palestine arrived as well the socialists who founded the Kibbutzny movement.
During World War I, when the British troops conducted battles with Ottoman within the Sinai Palestinian campaign, the British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour published the document which received subsequently the name of the Balfour Declaration. In him it was declared that Britain treats favorably restoration of the National Center for the Jewish people in Palestine.
In 1919-1923, the Third Aliyah. To Palestine prophets of 40,000 Jews, generally from Eastern Europe. Settlers of this wave were trained in agriculture and could develop economy. Swamps of the Izraelski Valley and the Valley Heifer were drained and the earth is made suitable for agriculture. During this period the Federation of Trade Unions, Histadrut, was founded. The Arab protests against the Jewish immigration developed into riots that promoted formation of the Jewish militarized self-defense. Haganah. In 1922 the League of Nations handed to Great Britain the mandate to Palestine, explaining it with need of establishment in the country of political, administrative and economic conditions for safe formation of the Jewish national home. Already at the very beginning of operation of the mandate the Arab revolts in Jaffa forced Great Britain to limit the Jewish immigration. The part of the territory intending for the Jewish state was given for formation of Transjordan. At the time the country Muslim Arabs, however, inhabited generally the largest city, Jerusalem. I was mainly Jewish. In 1924-1928, the Fourth Aliyah. To Palestine there arrived 85,000 Jews, from whom then left the country about 20,000.
Rise in Nazi ideology in the 1930th years in Germany brought to the Fifth Scarlet, within which to Palestine prophets of 250,000 German Jews. Its period ended with the Arab Revolt of 1936-1939 and the addition with Great Britain in 1939 of the White Book, which actually nullified immigration of Jews to Palestine.
Other countries refused to accept the Jews escaping from accident, and the ban on immigration to Palestine could become for them the death sentence. For a circumvention of the ban on immigration, the underground organization, Mossad al-Ijabet, helping Jews to reach illegally Palestine and to escape from accident, was created.
Upon termination of World War II, the Jewish population of Palestine made 33% in comparison with 11% in 1922.
David Ben-Gurion declares independence of Israel on May 14, 1948 under Theodor Herzl's portrait.
After 1945, tension between the mandatory authorities and the Jewish Yishuv continued to grow.
In 1947, the British government refused the mandate to Palestine, having declared that it can't find a solution acceptable at the same time for Arabs and Jews.
Shortly before that, the created United Nations adopted on November 29, 1947 the plan of the partition of Palestine.
This plan provided the termination of the British mandate in Palestine and recommended creation for her territories of two states: Jewish and Arab. Jerusalem and Bethlehem, according to the decision of the Union, had to become the territory under the international control not to allow the conflict on the status of these cities. The Jewish Agency, which, in addition, performed at the time some functions of the government of Yishuv, decided to adopt the Plan of U. On the contrary, the League of Arab States and the Supreme Arab Council categorically rejected the plan of the Union for the partition of Palestine and stated that the plan violates the rights of most of the population of Palestine, which consisted for 67% from non-Jews. The Arab leaders promised to use the best efforts not to allow his realization.
On May 14, 1948, and one day prior to the termination of the British mandate to Palestine, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed creation of the independent Jewish state in the territory allocated according to the plan of the Union.
Already next day, the League of Arab States declared to Israel war, and at once 5 Arab states: Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq and Transjordan attacked the new country. After a year of fighting, in July 1949, the ceasefire agreement with Egypt, Lebanon, Transjordan and Syria, according to which under control of the Jewish state there were also Western Galilee and a corridor from the seaside plain to Jerusalem, which were originally intending to the Arab state, was accepted. Jerusalem was divided through ceasefire between Israel and Transjordan. These temporary borders received the name Green Line. On May 11, 1949, the State of Israel was recognized as the Dikavu. The Arab state wasn't created. Instead, the Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt and the she part of territories of Judea and Samaria, as well as East Jerusalem, which had to remain under control of the Union within Big Jerusalem, are occupied, and then annexed by Transjordan.
Prior to military operations in 1948, about 750,000 Arabs lived in Palestine. During the War of Independence of Israel, hundreds of thousands of Arab residents of Palestine elump.
5 left the houses which are in the territory allocated, according to the resolution of the Union, for the Jewish state, and a part of the territory allocated under the Arab state. Most of the Arab refugees moved on the rest of the territory determined by the resolution for the Arab state. Many also emigrated to other Arab states. In Israel there were only about 160,000 Arabs.
The Israeli authorities refused to let refugees back in places of their accommodation after war, and lands and real estate of refugees were confiscated by the State of Israel.
In the Arab world, these events received the name Nakba. Accident. In the same time, in Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Syria and Iraq there took place the anti-Jewish demonstrations and cruel riots. As a result of over 800,000 Jews were expelled or fled from the Arab countries to just create a Jewish state. This process, according to the Israeli side, should be considered as Massachusetts' exchange of the population in the region, as the place of 600,000 Arabs in the territory of Israel was taken by 820,000 Jewish refugees. Nevertheless, the fate only of the Arab refugees became the main subject of disagreements in the Arab-Israeli conflict. The first years of existence of Israel were celebrated by Massachusetts' immigration of the Jews who survived an accident, and also those which, escaping from prosecutions, left the Arab countries.
From 1948 to 1958, the population of Israel increased from 0.8 million up to 2 million people.
Most of immigrants were refugees and had practically at themselves no property. They were placed in temporary camps. By 1952, over 200,000 immigrants lived in similar tent towns.
Need of the solution of this crisis forced David Ben-Gurion to go for signing of the contract with Germany on reparations that caused Massachusetts protests of the Jews revolted with the idea of cooperation with Germany.
Within the first decades of existence of the Jewish state, the Arab countries continued to challenge legality of his creation, and the Arab nationalists, to call for his destruction. In 1956, Israel joined the Union of Great Britain and France, seeking to return control over the Suez Canal nationalized by Egypt.
After capture of the Sinai Peninsula during Suez Crisis, Israel was forced to recede under pressure of the USA and the USSR in exchange for guarantees of pass of the Israeli vessels through the Suez Canal and their entry in the Red Sea. In 1967, Egypt, Syria and Jordan drew up the troops to borders of Israel, expelled Union peacekeepers and blocked an entrance to the Israeli ships to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
In the performance on radio, the president of Egypt, Nasser, urged the Arab states to dump Israel in the sea. This effects of steel for the leadership of Israel of a reason for the preventive attack and the beginning of the war, which became history under the name 6 Day. Israel I won in her a convincing fast victory, having taken the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. On October 6, 1973, on Yom Kippur, Doomsday, sacred day in the Jewish calendar when all believing Jews are in synagogues, Egypt and Syria at the same time attacked Israel, having taken unawares in the government. Despite considerable losses, attack it was reflected, and then the Israeli troops moved fighting to the territory of the opponent before the ceasefire agreement was reached. The internal investigation of circumstances of war relieved responsibility from the government. The discontent of the public forced the Prime Minister Golda Meir to resign. In 1978, the historical visit to Israel of the President of Egypt Anwar Sadat took place. This event became the first step to recognition of the State of Israel from the head of the Arab state.
On March 26, 1979, Anwar Sadat and Menahem Begin signed the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, under which Israel returned to Egypt the Sinai Peninsula and I promised to begin negotiations on creation of Palestinian Authority.
In 1982, Israel interfered with the civil war in Lebanon to destroy Palestine Liberation Organization. PLO. Bases where attacks on Israel prepared.
This operation was called World Galilee, but the First Lebanon War received the unofficial name subsequently.
The management and fighters of UP were forced to leave Lebanon, and in 1985 Israel disengaged troops from the most part of the territory of this country, except a buffer zone which remained under the Israeli control till 2000.
In 1994, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty was signed that made Jordan the second Arab country normalizing a relationship with Israel. On July 12, 2006, the Lebanese Shiite organization, Hezbollah, supported by Syria and Iran, launched several missiles on the Israeli settlements and attacked positions of the Israeli troops, having captured 2 soldiers. These actions became a push to the Second Lebanon War, in which Israel didn't achieve significant weakening of Hezbollah and I curtailed operation after intervention of U. Upon termination of World War II, the conflict between the Palestinian Arabs and Jews escalated again. After acceptance in November 1947 of the Union of the Plan for the Partition of Palestine into 2 states, local collisions developed into the full-scale war, which ended with declaration of independence and a victory of Israel.
In the same time, there was a problem of the Palestinian refugees. From 1949 to 1967, Israel constantly was attacked by the Palestinian fighters. Fadain. With the occupied Egypt and Jordan of territories, therefore more than 450 of his citizens died.
Defeat of the Arab states in Six-Day War in 1967 and receiving by Israel control over all territory intending both for Jewish and for the Arab state, led to growth of the Arab radicalism and terrorism, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Blow.
Stirred up activity which purpose announced armed struggle as the only way of release of the homeland. In the late 60s, the beginning of the 1970s, the Palestinian terrorists undertook the first wave of the attacks on Israelis worldwide. One of the loudest terrorist attacks not only during this conflict, but also around the world, RIA Novosti calls the taking of the Israeli athletes at the Summer Olympic Games of 1972 in Munich, which ended with their death. In 1970, after attempt to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy, the Palestinian militarized organizations were expelled from Jordan and moved the activity to Lebanon. Palestinians actively interfered with the civil war in Lebanon and created an enclave in the southern part of the country, from which territory they made regular terrorist attacks on Israel and large campaigns of the international terrorism.
It led to invasion of the Israeli army into Lebanon in 1982 and to exile of UP from Lebanon to Tunis. In 1987, strengthening of friction between the Israeli authorities and the population of territories gave an impetus to the beginning of the First Intifada. Revolts mined the Israeli management. In her course, from November 1987 to August 1993, 157 Israelis from among civilians became the victims of terrorist attacks. 4195 more Israeli citizens were wounded. According to the press service of Israel Defense Forces, 66 Israeli servicemen died, 18 servicemen were wounded. For the same 6 years were killed by the staff of the Israeli Security Services 808, and Palestinians are wounded. 985 more Palestinians were killed by compatriots.
During the war in the Persian Gulf in 1991, many Palestinian Arabs supported Saddam Hussein and welcomed firings by the Iraqi rockets of the territory of Israel.
In October 1991, after defeat of Iraq, in Madrid there took place the International Conference on the Middle East, in which the representatives of Palestinians who were regularly living on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip for the first time participated. After in 1992 Yitzhak Rabin became the Prime Minister of Israel, Israel advanced policy of a compromise with the Arab neighbors.
In 1993 in Washington, in the presence of Rabin, the leader of UP Yasser Arafat and Bill Clinton, peace agreements according to which the Palestinian National Authority,
which received control over a part of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, was created, were signed. In reply, UP undertook to recognize Israel and to stop terrorist activity.
Support of peace agreements by the Israeli society declined as a result of a series of acts of terrorism which began in 1994.
In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was killed.
Despite loss of trust to process of Oslo, in the late 90s the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu disengaged troops from Hebron and signed the Memorandum of the River, granting to Palestinians it is more than rights of self-government. In July 2000, with mediation of the United States President Bill Clinton in Camp David, negotiations of the Prime Minister of Israel Ehud Barak with Yasser Arafat heading took place.
Then Barak offered the plan of creation of the Palestinian state for 97% of the territory of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. However, Arafat rejected him. After a failure of negotiations, the Palestinian Arabs began Al-Aqsa Intifada, the formal cause for which visit of the Temple Mount by the leader of opposition Ariel Sharon was. In 2001, Sharon became the Prime Minister of Israel. In August-September 2005, he carried out the plan of a unilateral exit from the Gaza Strip, as a result of which dozens of Jewish settlements were destroyed and more than 7,000 people removed. He also began construction of safe defense between the Israeli territory and the West Bank. After the Operation Protective Wall, performed by the Israeli troops in the spring of 2002, substantially liquidating terrorist infrastructure, scales of the Intifada of Al-Aqsa decreased. She also lost organized character in connection with change of leaders. In 2004, the Israeli Air Force destroyed leaders of the fundamentalist Islamic movement, Hamas, Ahmed Yassin and Abdel Rantisi. And in November of the same year, Yasser Arafat died.
At the same time, rocket and mortar attacks of the city of Sderot and adjacent kibbutzim from the Gaza Strip, which gained the actual independence, became the regular phenomenon.
According to B'Tselem human rights organization, since the beginning of the Intifada of Al-Aqsa in September 2000 till December 2008, the beginning of the Operation Cast Lead by the Israeli armed forces and civilians, more than 4,900 Palestinians were killed during the Operation Cast Lead, nearly 1,400, and after her termination, about 3,350. About 700 more Palestinians were killed in intestine fight. According to the Israeli data, for the same period since the beginning of the Intifada of Al-Aqsa, the Palestinian side killed more than 1,300 Israelis and citizens of other countries.
In 2006, during democratic elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council, the victory was won by movement Hamas, recognized as many countries terrorist.
As the management of Hamas, having come to the power, refused to recognize the agreements with Israel which were earlier concluded by and to disarm the fighters, the EU and the USA began economic boycott of the government of Hamas. In June 2007, as a result of military takeover, Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip, having expressed the intention to create there the Islamic State.
In reply to June 14, the chairman of NA and the leader of Fatah Mahmoud Abbas declared dissolution of the government, imposed an emergency rule in the territory of autonomy, and took all completeness of the power in hand.
As a result of the broken-out war for the power of Hamas kept the positions only in the Gaza Strip, whereas on the West Bank the power was kept by Abbas's supporters. From this point repeatedly, including in 2012 and 2017, appeared about exhaustion of the conflict between Hamas and management and formation of national unity government, but contradictions remain not overcome. In October 2007, Israel announced the Gaza Strip hostile state education and started his partial economic blockade. From now on, Israel controls airspace and coastal areas of Gaza and also movement of its inhabitants out of borders of the sector and trade with the rest of the world, except for the Philadelphian Corridor on the southern border of Gaza, which controls Egypt. Besides elevated protecting barriers and patrols, construction of the underground walls on multi-meter depth designed to prevent digging of tunnels on which the Palestinian fighters get on the territory of Israel is conducted.
Within blockade of the sector of Gaza in 2010, the Israeli naval forces intercepted on an entrance to territorial waters a so-called flotilla of freedom with humanitarian aid, having caused sharp international reaction. The internal political situation in the Gaza Strip is extremely unstable. Under control of Hamas, it remains the base for the armed attacks of the territory of Israel.
At the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009, Israel performed the large-scale operation Cast Lead, which, however, didn't lead to elimination of the mode of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Two more large-scale military operations in the Gaza Strip, a Cloudy Pillar and the Indestructible Rock, which were carried out respectively in 2012 and 2014, also ended only with tactical progress, without solving the main strategic objective on elimination of military and political capacity of Hamas. The beginning of the 1960th years was marked by taking by the Israeli intelligence agencies of one of the most high-ranking Nazi criminals, Adolf Eichmann, hiding in Argentina.
Eichmann was architect and a pretorital in life of the final decision of a Jewish problem during World War II.
Public trial of him became the major stage in understanding of scales of accident of the European Jewry and received the international resonance.
The death sentence to Eichmann became the second and last sentence such carried out in Israel.
The serviceman executed to him under sentence of field court was rehabilitated later.
Elections to the Knesset of 1977 became an important milestone in the internal political history of Israel. Following the results, the Likud party under the leadership of Menahem Begin received a majority of votes of voters, having for the first time selected control over the country at the Marak bloc, which was switching on the Israeli Labor Party, which under different names was in power without interruption since the foundation of Israel.
The era of domination of one party in the Israeli policy was replaced by the period of rivalry of the left and right blocs dispersing on three key parameters.
Foreign policy, a role of the state and the market and economy, and a relationship of religion and the state.
With coming to power in the USSR of Mikhail Gorbachev and under pressure of the United States government, the procedure of emigration from the USSR was simplified.
In 1989, Massachusetts repatriation from the USSR to Israel began.
I played a role in the fact that since October 1989 in the USA, reception of the Jewish refugees from the USSR was limited in growth of number of repatriates. He was promoted also by manifestations of antisemitism. In 1989-1990 in Israel there arrived more than 200,000 repatriates from the USSR. Only for December 1990 there arrived 35,600 people.
Recession and rates of repatriation was outlined in the beginning of 1991 when Israel came under rocket attacks during the war in the Persian Gulf.
Nevertheless, arrival of Jews from the USSR, and after his disintegration from the new sovereign states continued, and from 1992 to 2000 on average to Israel there came annually from 46 to 67,000 Jews from these countries and dicks of their families. In total during Big Aliyah in Israel there arrived more than 1 million repatriates from the USSR and the CIS. The Operation Solomon, which also took place in May 1991 when 15,000 Ethiopian Jews were taken out to Israel in 3 days, coincided with Massachusetts repatriation from the USSR. Since the beginning of the odd years there is a decrease in volumes of repatriation from the countries of the former USSR. So, in 2003 to Israel there arrived to the permanent residence only 12.5 thousand people from CIS and Baltic countries. From 23,000 repatriates accepted by Israel in 2005, the share of natives of the countries of the former USSR made already less than 50%. New growth of rates of repatriation, in particular from Russia and Ukraine, was outlined only in the middle of the next decade.
A quantity of repatriates doesn't manage to be arranged in Israel and they leave the country.
According to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, for 2007, more than 100,000 repatriates returned on the permanent residence from Israel to the CIS countries, and about 70,000 Israelis lived only in one Moscow.
The number of the repatriates leaving the country in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century approached 35–40% of number driving to Israel.
In 2015, 8.5 and 30,000 respectively. Russian-speaking made 38% of 290,000 Israelis who left the country from 1990 to 2014. Israel, the parliamentary republic, the democratic state with the general right to vote. The formal head of state is the President of Israel, however his duties, besides approval of candidacy of the Prime Minister and recommendations of pardon of prisoners or decrease in an imprisonment term, mostly ceremonial. The President is elected by the Knesset for one term lasting 7 years. Restriction of powers with one 7-year term works since 2000. In 1963–1998 the President could be elected twice for 5-year term. The Prime Minister is a head of the government, the maximum term of finding of the Prime Minister in a position -4 years, before the next elections to the Knesset. According to the basic law about the government, the President of Israel within 7 days after the end of elections to the Knesset, after consultations with leaders of the political parties which received representation, charges formation of the government to one of members of the Knesset, as a rule, to the leader of the fraction which received the majority of seats in parliament. The candidate forms the government coalition, represents the option of structure of an office and, in case of receiving a vote of confidence, becomes the head of the government.
In case the candidate couldn't get support of most of deputies of the Knesset and create the government within 42 days after elections, the President has the right to transfer the mandate to formation of the government to other dick of the Knesset.
If the government can't be created, repeated elections appear. From 1996 to 2001 the Prime Minister was elected citizens directly. Elections of the head of the government took place in parallel with parliamentary.
During that time the Israeli citizens 3 times elected the Prime Minister on direct elections until in 2002 Ariel Sharon, anxious with the amplifying sectoral crushing in Israeli policy, carried out the law on their cancellation.
The Knesset, unicameral Israeli parliament, consists of 120 deputies. The political parties which broke a percentage barrier from elections to the Knesset of the 19th convocation makes 25% are represented in it in proportion to results of national elections by party lists. Parliamentary elections are held each 4 years or more often, on condition of support by the simple majority of deputies of the decision on early elections. In exceptional cases, the Knesset can also make the decision on extension of the powers. So, elections to the Knesset of the 8th convocation were postponed because of War of the Doomsday. Belong to duties of the Knesset adoption of laws, including basic laws, supervision of activity of the government, the statement of ministers and elections of some other officials, including the president and the state controller. The Knesset has the right to deprive of any of the deputies of immunity, to discharge of a position of the president, the state controller and the prime minister, and also to vote non-confidence to the government what requires not less than 61 votes of deputies. Israel has the three-level judicial system. The lower level are the magistrates' courts located in the majority of the cities of the country. Above them there are district courts located in 6 Israeli districts. They consider appeal cases and also function as courts of first instance. The third, highest level, the Supreme Court, which is located in Jerusalem. He also carries out a double role, both considering appeals, and working as court of first instance, the Supreme Court of Justice. He carries out the last role, considering addresses of both citizens, and not citizens of the state mind solutions of the governments. The Israeli system of the legislation combines in itself the English general legislation, civil laws and the Jewish right. It is based on the stare decisis system, precedents, and a so-called adversarial system when the parties produce the evidence to court. Lawsuits understand professional judges, but not jurors. Marriages and stains are under jurisdiction of religious courts. Jewish, Muslim, Druze and Christian. Special Committee of the Knesset, members of the Supreme Court and Israeli Bar have rights to elect new judges. Israel isn't a part of the International Criminal Court for fears that his decisions will be prejudiced because of the international political pressure. Division of parties in Israel on left and right is caused by positions on a number of key questions, the most important of which is, unlike the majority of the countries of Europe, not social and economic, but foreign policy, including such aspect as safe borders. However, a role is played also by subjects of a relationship of the state and religion and the rights and duties of separate ethnic and subethnic communities, therefore traditionally distinguished from political parties of Israel, not only left, right and centrist, but also religious and Arab. Till 1977 all governments of Israel were formed by the left-centrist bloc, as a rule, with the assistance of religious parties. After the Electoral Revolution of 1977 in political arena there is a continuous rivalry, wide left and wide right, the blocs concentrating respectively around the Israeli Labour Party and Likud parties taking a little more sub-central positions than their leaders. From 1984 to 1990, because of equality of forces of two blocs, so-called national unity governments managed the country.
Introduction in 1996 of the system of the direct elections of the Prime Minister parallel to parliamentary elections, led to strengthening of party polymorphism and growth of quantity in the Knesset of small sectoral parties and lists on which began to depend more when forming the coalition leaders of the largest parties. Ariel Sharon's attempt to create the new party in power, uniting moderate right and left leaders, wasn't successful. The Kadima party created two elections of 2006 quickly spent credibility and in 7 years hardly crossed an election threshold.
Till 1922 the basis of a legal system of the region was made by Madshala Ottoman codification. 1869-1876.
With obtaining the mandate by Great Britain in 1922, Ottoman laws were gradually replaced with Palestine British and since 1948 Israeli. However, finally Madshala was cancelled only in 1984 by the special Israeli law.
In 1980 the law on right bases which finally fixed independence of the Israeli legal system of British was adopted.
The Declaration of Independence of 1948 established on October 1 the same year as the term of adoption of the Constitution of Israel.
Nevertheless, the Constitution as the uniform document of the highest validity in Israel, it wasn't created, in view of disagreements on many questions in the Israeli society.
Some Israeli scientists consider that the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel can be considered as the Constitution, as it includes the list of the political and civil rights in that look in what he is recorded in a number of the democratic constitutions existing in the world. However, the Supreme Court of Israel decided that the Declaration of Independence is invalidly constitutional. The role approximate to a constitution role in the Israeli right, the basic laws of Israel devoted to different legal spheres and which were accepted on one since 1958 play. Essential feature of a legal system of Israel, inclusion of elements in her of the Jewish religious right, though the Israeli right not too identically religious right.
The area to which the religious legislation was incorporated completely, the personal status. Under jurisdiction of religious courts. Jewish, Muslim, Druze and Christian. There are acts of civil status. Marriage, a divorce, burial. Under the law of 1957, the Supreme Court of Justice of Israel, Bagatz. It is authorized to define a framework of competence of religious courts, transferring to their jurisdiction or withdrawing from it particular cases.
The aspiration of the Israeli society to the compromise acceptable for religious and not religious circles, and also to maintaining national traditions in the state and public life of the country, found expression in the so-called status quo, which developed even before emergence of the Jewish state.
Jurisdiction of religious courts in the field of the personal status. Marriages and stains of dicks of each community. Shabbat's recognition in the official afternoon of rest for Jews. Observance of requirements of kashrut in all state kitchens, including in military and police units and hospitals. Autonomous network of religious schools. The principles of Galaki partially had an impact on the immigration law. Law on return.
The Declaration of Independence of Israel proclaimed that the new state will be based on bases of freedom, justice and world. It will carry out full public and political equality of all the citizens without distinction of religion, race or a floor.
It will provide freedom of worship and conscience. the right of use of the native language, the right of education and culture. It will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. At the same time, from the moment of the basis in Israel, there was no law on human rights.
Only in 1992 two basic laws of Israel were adopted about freedom of occupations and about the advantage and freedom of the person, on the basis of which the full Bill of the Rights was constructed further.
The constitutional revolution in Israel was considered in the international academic circles as large achievement in the field of human rights.
However, a number of actions of the government of Israel and the laws adopted during finding in power of the right religious coalition sparked criticism and doubts that the status of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East remains real. The non-governmental organization of Freedom House, which is based in Washington, in the report for 2018 gave Israel the general mark of 2 of 7.
On a scale from 1, the most free country, up to 7, the least free country.
On a component of political freedoms, Israel in this report received the highest mark of 1 of 7. On a component of civil liberties, -3 of 7, that in particular was connected with adoption in 2017 of the laws limiting activity in the country of the organization supporting a campaign for boycott of Israel. At the same time, on the West Bank, most of which part is under military or administrative control of Israel, the rating of Freedom House is 6 of 7, and the rating of political freedoms -7 of 7.
The lowest possible mark.
The organization assigns fault for such situation with the rights and freedoms both to the Israeli side and to the authorities of the Palestinian National Authority.
In the annual rating of freedom of the press published by the Reporters Without Borders organization, Israel in 2018 took the 87th place from 180 estimated countries. Though in general the Israeli press is characterized as free, a phenomenon rare for the Middle East. Military censorship and violations of the rights of the Palestinian and foreign journalists, in particular regarding illumination of a situation in the Gaza Strip, downgrade. The policy pursued by the State of Israel in controlled territories sparks a wide public response and sharp criticism from a number of politicians, the Western funds and non-profit human rights organizations, among which there are Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Within the country, actions of the government are treated to criticism by such human rights organizations as B'Tselem. Reports of these organizations contain numerous statements about tortures in the Israeli prisons, deprivation of Palestinians of the civil rights, destruction of houses of Palestinians, aggressive behavior of the Jewish settlers to which the Israeli army closes eyes. Official representatives of Israel claim that the Union and human rights organizations apply to Israel double standards in questions of human rights. They say that Israel, the only democratic state in the Middle East, but the most part of criticism in the field of human rights in this region is directed against Israel.
The political scientist Mitchell Bard writes that the Israeli laws forbid arbitrary arrests and protect the rights of defendants, and judicial authority is independent of the government.
He also denies presence in Israel of political prisoners. Israel maintains diplomatic relations with 158 countries. They last on time in February 2014 established the relations with the Cook Islands and has more than 100 diplomatic missions.
Only 2 members of the League of the Arab States have the settled relationship with Israel throughout a long time: Egypt with 1979 and Jordan since 1994. Even change of the mode in Egypt and coming to power of Muslim Brotherhood was led only to lowering of the level of diplomatic relations between two countries, but not to their cap.
Mauritania improved full diplomatic relations in 1999, but in January 2009 announced freezing of a political and economic relationship with Israel in connection with the Israeli operation in the Gaza Strip.
Two other members of the League of the Arab States, Morocco and Tunisia, had diplomatic relations with Israel till 2000, but from the beginning of the Intifada of Al-Aqsa temporarily suspended them.
Then the trade mission of Israel was closed in Oman.
In August 2020 declared full normalization of a relationship with Israel, the UAE, and soon after them Bahrain. Under the Israeli laws, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia and Yemen are the enemy states, and the Israeli citizens have no right to visit these countries without special permission of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Since 1995, Israel is a dick of the Mediterranean dialogue, which stimulates interaction between 7 countries of the Mediterranean basin and dicks of Hodo.
Iran had diplomatic relations with Israel during board of a dynasty of Pahlavi, but after the Islamic Revolution broke all links. Turkey and Israel didn't support full diplomatic relationship up to 1991, though in every possible way interacted since 1949, from the moment of recognition by Turkey of Israel. However, after the Israeli operation Cast Lead in 2009 and the conflict with capture of Freedom Flotilla in 2010, a relationship with Turkey sharply worsened. Among the closest allies of Israel, the USA, Great Britain, Germany and India. The USA recognized Israel de facto already next day after declaration of independence, on May 15, 1948, and subsequently Israel received the status of the main ally of the USA out of Hodo.
In 2018, the United States Embassy in Israel was transferred to Jerusalem, that induced a number of the Latin American countries to follow their example.
For more than 10 years in the city which Israel proclaimed the capital, there was no foreign embassy. Close ties between Israel and Germany include interaction in science, education, military partnership and close economic relations.
India began full diplomatic relations in 1992 and since then encourages military and cultural cooperation with Israel.
Great Britain maintains full diplomatic relations with Israel from the moment of his education and also has strong commercial relations.
Since 1995, Israel is the associated member of the UN. In connection with the geographical location and political system, Israel is an important participant of the project of the Mediterranean Union and the Barcelonian process of the Euro-Mediterranean cooperation.
Israel is located in the southwest of Asia. From the west is washed by the Mediterranean Sea. In the south leads to the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea, in the north and the northeast borders, respectively, on Lebanon and Syria, in the southwest, on Egypt, in the east internationally recognized border passes down the River Jordan and on Green Line of 1949. Israel, owing to various factors, abstains from official definition of the borders.
A number of the Israeli lawyers consider that the territory isn't an obligatory element of the state at all.
There are several options of definition of the territory of Israel.
The resolution of the United Nations General Assembly No.
181/11 of November 29, 1947, which wasn't recognized as the Arab countries and then wasn't executed, remains the only international legal document in which the territory of the Jewish state is recorded. The document provided inclusion in the Jewish state of East Galilee, the Israelski Valley, the most part of the seaside plain, the Negev Desert. To the Arab state, the Western Galilee, the mountains of Judea and Samaria. Except for Jerusalem. Parts of the seaside plain from Asher to border with Egypt. Jerusalem and Bethlehem had to become territories under the international control. The sovereign territory of Israel, which developed as a result of the War of Independence of 1949 and recognized de facto as the majority of the countries of the world, is approximately equal to km, from which 2% are occupied with water.
The territory to which sovereignty of Israel was extended later, including East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, is equal to km.
The territory controlled by Israel now, including the lands under control of the Palestinian National Authority. On the West Bank occupied during Six-Day War makes 28177 km.
The Egyptian-Israeli border is established on border of the mandated territory of Palestine and fixed by the Contract of March 26, 1979.
The Jordanian-Israeli border is recorded by the Israeli-Jordanian Peace Treaty of October 26, 1994 in the area of border between the mandated territory of Palestine and the Emirate Transjordan, with some insignificant differences. Israel has no official borders with Lebanon and Syria. Recognized Union Blue Line divides Israel and Lebanon. The Fermi Sheba territory is disputable.
The role of border between Israel and Syria is played by the line of ceasefire established upon termination of War of the Doomsday.
1973. Along this line the Union created buffer zone. In 1967, as a result of a victory in Six-Day War, Israel received control over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. According to the resolutions of the General Assembly and Union Security Council based on the charter of the organization, these territories were announced by occupied.
In this regard, the resolution of the Union Security Council No. 242 of November 22, 1967, which proclaims two basic principles, became a basis for negotiations on settlement of the conflict.
Withdrawal of the Israeli armed forces from the territories occupied during the recent conflict. The termination of all claims or conditions of war and respect and recognition of sovereignty, territorial integrity and political independence of each state in this area and their rights to live in the world in safe and recognized borders, without being exposed to threats of force or its application.
The Sinai Peninsula was returned by Israel to Egypt in 1979 as a result of the conclusion of the Israeli-Egyptian Peace Treaty.
Soon after that, Israel declared annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The relevant laws adopted by the Knesset on July 30, 1980 and on December 14, 1981, in full distributed the civil legislation of Israel to these territories, and their population was granted the right of obtaining the Israeli citizenship.
This annexation, however, didn't gain diplomatic recognition from other states, and the Union Security Council in resolutions 478 and 497 condemned annexation and nullified actions of Israel, and not having the international validity.
Though other territories occupied in 1967 weren't annexed by Israel, Israel challenges their definition as occupied. The official position of Israel consists that these territories from the legal point of view are disputable, as earlier they didn't belong to any state in the world. Israel received them as a result of defensive war and has to them the historical right supported with the mandate of the League of Nations.
At the same time, Israel recognizes claims of the Palestinian Arabs for these territories and therefore considers that sovereignty over these territories should be settled during the peace talks.
A number of the Israeli and foreign politicians and lawyers adheres to a similar position. In 1967, after Six-Day War, the movement on restoration of historical Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, on the West Bank, and also in the Gaza Strip was created. Their creation was actively encouraged with the government of Israel, and in 2015, after their withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005,
the population of the settlements of Judea and Samaria made about 580,000 people and annually grew more than 4%.
The Union called existence of the Jewish settlements illegal and contradicting the Geneva Convention. Their existence and further construction are one of the most controversial issues in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are inhabited by mainly Palestinian Arabs, among whom the considerable share is made by refugees.
From 1967 to 1993, the population of these territories was under administrative control of the Israeli military authorities with elements of local government at the municipal level. After signing in 1993 of agreements of Oslo and the subsequent creation of the territory of the Gaza Strip, except for 12% of the territory occupied by the Israeli settlements was transferred under her control.
The territory of the West Bank was divided into 3 zones, and complete civil and military and police control of 18% of the territory, more than 55% of the Palestinian population of the West Bank.
And joint military control of and Israel and civil control of 21% of the territory and 41% of the population.
With partial civil and complete military control of Israel, 61% of the territory and 4% of the Arab population. The safety fence built in 2003 separating the West Bank from the territory of Israel considerably reduced number of terrorist attacks.
At the same time, he, according to Palestinians, complicates economic activity and movement on the area. The International Court of Justice recognized in the advisory opinion construction of the dividing barrier violating international law.
This decision by the vast majority of voices was supported by the United Nations General Assembly. In some cases, Israel agrees to transfer of a fence of safety to facilitate to the Palestinian Arabs access to their land possession. In 2005, within policy of unilateral delimitation, Israel liquidated the military and settlement presence in the Gaza Strip. However, the armed opposition between the movement, Hamas, controlling the Gaza Strip and Israel continues.
National Park Khan Hashlosha,
Sakna. Topographical: the territory of Israel can be divided into 4 zones. A coastal plain from 1 to 32 km wide with the flat coastline of the Mediterranean Sea, in the north of complicated by the Cape of Carmel and Hafskila Gulf. Mountains and the hills of Galilee, including Carmel's range extended on the southeast from Haifa and the highest point of Galilean mountains, Top Meron.
Judea and Samaria.
The Rift Jordanian Valley, including the lowest place on the land, 403 m below sea level. Negev Plateau. Troti-Calcareous Plateau. Negev occupies all territory of Israel to the south from the Judaic Desert, between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, up to the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. This plateau is characterized by various forms of arid denudation and an erosion of breeds. For Israel and the Sinai Peninsula craters, Maktashi, or erosive circuses, are unique. The crater located in Negev Ramon, the biggest crater of this sort in the world, its length -40 kilometers, and width up to 10 kilometers. Till old years was considered that Israel doesn't differ in richness of natural resources. However, they found large-scale deposits of natural gas and slate oil changed this assessment. Prospective resources of oil of Israel, without slate, are estimated at 4.2 billion barrels. Reserves of slate oil are estimated at 250 billion barrels, that is comparable to explored reserves of oil in Saudi Arabia. Since 2008, commercial production of shelf natural gas is conducted. His total explored reserves are estimated at 1037 billion m. In the country there are unprofitable fields of copper, phosphorites, sulfur, manganese, limestone, marble are extracted. Waters of the Dead Sea contain significant amounts of potash, salt and bromine. The Big Russian Encyclopedia characterizes climate of Israel in general as damp Mediterranean. However, proximity of the sea in the west, the extensive desert in the south and several mountain chains create a number of zones which microclimate differs from an average markedly. So in Galilee 10 of rainfall a year, in the neighborhood of Eilat drop out, on average, there are 20 of rainfall a year, 700 drop out in the mountains of Judea and 100 in the east of Negev. Temperature in Israel varies over a wide range, especially during the winter. In mountain regions it can be cold, sometimes it is snowing. On the Mount Hermon in the winter snow often drops out, and in Jerusalem usually there is, at least, one snowfall in a year. At the same time, on the coastal plain the Mediterranean climate with cool rainy winter and dominates in the long hot summer. Extreme temperatures were recorded in June 1942, 54 C in the Valley Beit Shean, and February 1950, -13 C in the Valley Beit Netofa in the Lower Galilee. The most high temperature for a lifetime of the state, -47 C, is also recorded near the city of Beit Shean. From May to September of drought in Israel, drop out seldom. Water resources of the country are limited. From the beginning of the 21st century in Israel, the acute shortage of water is felt. Under the terms of the peace treaty, Israel delivers fresh water to Jordan that in 30 years is wrapped in deficiency of fresh water for the supplying country. The largest river in the country is Jordan, which length is 322 km. Jordan flows from the north on the south through the Lake Kinneret to Viryetsko and flows into the Dead Sea. Jordan is one of 4 rivers which aren't drying up in the summer, along with Kishon flowing into the Mediterranean Sea near Haifa. The river of Alexander Yanea flowing into the Mediterranean Sea to the north of Netanya, and Yarkon flowing into the Mediterranean Sea near Tel Aviv. The Lake Kinneret, 21 long and 10 km wide, the biggest fresh lake in the country. Its area is 166 km. The Dead Sea, the content of salts in which is more than 330 promille, is among the most salty reservoirs of the world. Level of the Dead Sea goes down because of use of a drain of Jordan. From 395 m below sea level in 1970 to 418 in 2006. On average in a year in Israel 6 km drop out. Rainfall. Underground waters contain considerable impurity of bicarbonates that is them rigid.
In the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, cache resources of fresh water were estimated approximately at 1.8 km.
In a year. It is the sum of what the small rivers, streams and springs give. 1.1 km. Yarkon River and its inflows. 0.215 km. 0.32 km. The Jordan River falling to the share of the Israeli part, and 0.18 km. Received for the account of collecting rainwater, sewage treatment and desalting of seawater.
The first plant on desalting of saltish water and water of the Dead Sea supplying the city of Eilat began to be under construction in 1961. The station freshened 3,700 cubic meters of water a day.
On September 4, 2001, the group of companies won a competition on construction of the first station in desalting of seawater. Construction began in 2003 in the city of Ashkelon. The station began to work on October 4, 2005.
Production capacity of installation minus 100 million cubic meters a year.
On May 16, 2010 in the city of Hadera the second plant on desalting of seawater was started. Now in Israel 5 plants on desalting of seawater. Ashkelon, Hadera, Palmachim, Sorek, Ashdod. Work. The largest of them. Hebrew. Giving 150 million cubic meters of water, was constructed in 2013 near the Sorek River.
By 2016, desalination constructions provided 55% of needs of Israel for water.
For water supply, underground tanks are also used. The largest of them, coastal, extended along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to the south from Caesarea, and mountain, representing the underground lake to the south of Zichron Yaakov. Despite the small size of the country, her soil are characterized by a huge variety. It is explained by their various origin, properties and various nature of an erosion. Wind and water. Maternal breeds. Basalt, various sedimentary rocks, sandy dunes, alluvia, etc. Climate. From droughty in the south to damp in the north. And topography. Generally brown and grey-brown soils, in the south, desert grey-brown soils, and on the coastal plain, alluvial are extended to territories of the country.
In droughty northern Negev, because of proximity of the coastal plain, alluvial loessl soils meet.
The majority of soils of the country of Amaloplodorodna, including as a result of irrational land use. Works on restoration of a soil cover and increase in its fertility are conducted with the beginning of the 20th century. In Israel, borders of 3 vegetable belts meet. Mediterranean, Irano-Taransky and Sakhara-Sinsky. In the country there are about 2,600 plant species. 250 endemic. from 700 childbirth entering into 115 families.
By the time of finding of independence by Israel in his territory by the Jewish National Fund planted 4.5 million trees, and by their 21st century in the country there is more than 200 million. From 6% of the territory of the country covered with the wood near
or artificial plantings. In forest plantations most often plant the Aleppo pine, an acacia and an eucalyptus, while for gardening of settlements use a cypress, a beefwood, a ficus, a tamarisk, an oleander and pistachio. The natural wood remained in mountainous areas in Galilee, Samaria, Judaic mountains and on Carmel's range. Natural vegetation also remained in desert areas. The fauna of Israel totals more than 100 species of mammals, over 600 bird species, about 100 species of reptiles, including 30 species of snakes, and about 10 species of amphibians, and also thousands of species of insects, including more than 100 species of butterflies. More than a half of bird species constantly live in the country, the others are flying. In coastal waters of Israel, dolphins and dugongs meet. In total, in Israel about 400 reserves and national parks in total occupying about a quarter of the territory of the country are created. In 1963, under the auspices of the Ministry of the Head of the Government in Israel, management of reserves, together with Society on Environment Protection conducting works on protection and restoration of natural landscapes is created. Environmental problems of Israel are connected with the shortage of water, overpopulation, industrial emissions and waste. According to the report of Environmental Performance Index published in 2016 by specialists of Yale University, Israel took the 49th place on an ecological situation from 180 included countries, having risen from the 66th place at the beginning of a decade. The condition of the water sources exhausted as a result of growth of water consumption causes the greatest concern. Natural water resources aren't enough for ensuring needs of Israel and, according to the peace treaty, Jordan. Besides, use of agricultural fertilizers and infiltration of seawater in the coastal tank worsen quality of the available reserves of fresh water. For overcoming water crisis in Israel, researches of cheap ways of desalting of seawater commercially are conducted. Air pollution remains other problem. In 2016, on purity of air, Israel took only the 136th place in the report of Environmental Performance Index. Also takes the low place Israel by such criterion as environment protection and species under the threat of disappearance. At the same time, Israel is one of the few countries in which growth of forest plantings is noted. According to the Central Statistical Bureau of Israel for December 31, 2019, the total number of the population of Israel is 9,136,000 people. From them, 6,772,000, 74.1%. Jews, 1,916,000, 21%. Arabs, Christians, Muslims and Druzes, 448,000, 4.9%. Ethnic minorities, Armenians, Circassians, Christians of the non-Arab origin, representatives of other religions. This number doesn't include the foreigners living in Israel, including foreign workers. The number for the end of 2015 according to TSU of Israel made 183,000 people.
Same year 580,000 citizens of Israel lived in settlements in Judea and Samaria.
As of 2016, 22,000 Israelis lived on the Golan Heights.
Data of the demographic forecast according to which by 100-year anniversary of Israel in 2048 the population of the country has to reach 15.2 million people are provided in the message of Israel for the Press of Milan, 2017 devoted to the 69th anniversary from the date of formation of the State of Israel.
In 2018, according to the website Countometers, in Israel 181,000 were born and 45,000 people died. Natural annual increase minus 1.66%. According to the World Factbook for 2018, 1.49%, the 73rd place in the world. Birth rate coefficient in 2018. Assessment. Minus 17.9 children on 1,000 people of the population, mortality rate minus 5.2 on 1,000. Since 2002 annual gain of the Jewish population increases. 1.38% in 2002, 1.85% in 2014.
Growth of the expanded Jewish population including non-Jews from the mixed families in 2014 was
94%, and in absolute figures was 1.5 times higher than in 9 years before. Rates of annual gain of the Muslim population, on the contrary, since 2000 decrease, 2.24% in 2014, the lowest indicator from the moment of finding of independence by Israel. A share of Jews among all live-born babies in the country in 2001 making. I grew in 2014 to 74%, the share of Arabs for the same period decreased from 30.5% to 22.9%. In 2017 the total coefficient of birth rate among Jews, 3.16 children on the woman, was higher than among the Israeli Arabs, 3.11 in comparison with 9.5 in 1960. The average annual death rate among the Jewish population of the country for all the time of her existence was 6.62 on 1,000 people. 5.78 in 2014.
Among the Muslim population the annual death rate decreased from 8.67 on 1,000 people to
2.48 in 2010. Small increase was observed after that. According to assessment of Search of Israel, in 2016 in Israel 44% of the total number of Jews lived in the world. As of 2015, from Jews of Israel 4.75 million were born in this country. Sabra. And 1.53 million were repatriates. Alem. On the country of origin of the Israeli Jews for 2016.
About 690,000 were natives or children of natives of the countries of Asia,
including more than 220,000 from Iraq and more than 130,000 from Iran and from Yemen. Nearly 900,000 from the countries of Africa, first of all, from Maghreb, including over 480,000 from Morocco and also more than 135,000 from Ethiopia. Nearly 95 million from the countries of Europe, America and Oceania, including nearly 900,000 from the USSR and the countries of the former Soviet Union, nearly 200,000 from Romania and over 180,000 from Poland. More than 2.8 million in the second generation, with the father Sabro. On population density, 387 people/km. Israel in 2019 took the 34th place in the world.
The planned state budget of Israel for 2019 makes 479.6 billion shekels at the planned deficit of 2.9%.
In comparison with previous year, growth of the budget is 4.3%. The state tax revenues for 2018 were reduced by 4.5 billion shekels at growth of the public expenditures by 18 billion shekels.
The volume of DDD of Israel on PPS for 2018 according to the World Bank was 362.
$34 billion, the 50th place in the world and the 5th in Southwest Asia.
After Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran and O.
On gross national product per capita, PPS, of dollars in 2017, Israel took the 55th place in the world. DDD growth of Israel for 2018 was 3.3%. The structure of economy of Israel has lines, characteristic of post-industrial society, with the prevailing services sector role in VVV. In volume of DDD, the share of industrial production for 2017 made 26.5%, services sectors -69.5%, agriculture -2.4%. Total number of able-bodied population -4.021 million people, estimated unemployment rate -4.2%. The 55th place in the world. Israel is considered one of the most developed countries in Southwest Asia on economic and industrial development. The country took the 49th position from 190 in the rating of the World Bank Ease of Business, according to the report of 2018, the in 16th place from 137. In the Index of Global Competitiveness of the World Economic Forum in 2017. As of 2017, in the rating of the best countries for business, made by the Forbes magazine, Israel took the 24th place in the world from 161. In 2004, Israel was on the first place by the number of the companies in the index of Nasdaq among the countries outside North America, and in the 2014 took the second place after China in the list of all companies, Nasdaq, etc.
As of 2018, Israel remained the only Middle Eastern state presented in listing of Nasdaq.
All 98 companies from the Middle East in listing were based in Israel.
In 2010, Israel was admitted to ODE, which includes the countries of the world which are most developed in the social and economic plan. Israel is the world leader in technologies of protection of water resources and geothermal power. His advanced technologies in the software, telecommunications, natural sciences do it by an analog of Silicon Valley in Shaw. Among the companies which constructed the first foreign centers of research and development in Israel, Intel, Microsoft and Apple. In 2006, the American billionaire Warren Buffett acquired a controlling stake of the Israeli company Iskar for $4 billion that became his first acquisition outside the USA, and redeemed the rest of actions 7 years later.
At the same time, a hint of doubt in self-sufficiency of the Israeli economy, including subsidies and the help from abroad, first of all, from Shaw, is dropped.
Israel is in the lead on the total amount of the help received from the USA after World War II.
In 2017, the country received from the USA $3.776 billion, including $3.175 billion on not concretized defense expenditures.
At the beginning of the 2010 years, the share of the American help in the defense budget of Israel made up to 22%.
The industry of Israel makes high-tech products and also goods from paper and wood, potash and phosphoric fertilizers, caustic-grated also other chemicals, medicines, construction materials, plastic, deprocessed diamonds, textiles, footwear, foodstuff, drinks and tobacco. Growth of industrial production in 2017 was 4%. Raw materials, arms, means of production, the rough diamonds, fuel, grain, consumer goods are imported to Israel generally. According to data of Institute of the Middle East, in the Israeli export for 2016, 23.6% made the faceted diamonds, 19.7%, the computer, electronic and optical equipment, 12.4%, products of chemical industry and 11.5%, products of defense industry. In 2017 the country took the 5th place in the world on export of weapon and defensive technologies, after the USA, Russia, France and Germany. In 5 years before in Israel there were 1006 companies and 312 independent businessmen in the sphere of export of defensive products.
The State of Israel conducts policy of subsidizing of the enterprises occupied with researches and implementation of new technologies, annually allocating about $400 million for these purposes.
The Israeli Department of Innovations is engaged in distribution of subsidies, earlier known as Bureau of the Chief Scientist, at the Ministry of Trade. The companies receiving subsidies pay to the Ministry of Compensation in the form of percentage allocations from product sales. The management receives back annually about $100 million. The Israeli forks out date at the left, and a modern sample and the socket adapted for both types. Israel completely provides own needs for the electric power. In 2015 was, by assessment given by the World Factbook, 44 billion euro developed each, also 52.78 billion euro consumed each. 5.2 billion euro sold each electric power. In the sphere of power supply for many years the Electric Company of Israel was monopolist.
Since 2013 electricity generation commercially by private power plants which share in the general development by 2016 reached 29% began, however in the first years they could sell the electric power to the consumer only through the intermediary. In 2018, after the preparatory processes lasting more than 20 years, the agreement on opening for the competition of the market of consumer power supply was signed that has to allow to reduce prices of electricity for the consumer.
According to the World Factbook, 1.1% of able-bodied population are engaged in agriculture of Israel, however they provide the country with food for 93%. Some grain and oil-bearing crops, meat, coffee, cocoa and sugar are imported to Israel. At the same time the considerable volume of own agricultural products of Israel is exported.
In 2005, 2.4% of the total cost of commodity export of the country fell to his share.
By various estimates, each Israeli occupied in agriculture is capable to support from more than 50 to more than 90 compatriots. About 80% of agricultural products are the share of two types of farms, kibbutzim and moshava. Cooperative villages with the mixed managing type. The most important branches of agriculture.
Production of citrus fruit crops, vegetables, cotton, beef, fowl, milk. During the period since 1950 on the middle of the 1990th years there was a significant increase in the area of the farmlands including irrigated.
In the 1990s of the making about a half from the total area of 455,000 hectares. At the same time between 1952 and 1984 there was an eightfold increase in volume of agricultural products. In the largest volumes cotton, peanut, sunflower, wheat, citrus fruit crops, which considerable part of a harvest goes for export. Tomatoes, potatoes are grown up. Over 60% of all water consumed by Israel are the share of the agricultural sector.
The general production of milk in 2010 in Israel was 1.304 billion L, in 2014, 1.523 billion L.
The average Israeli cow gives a year L of milk. Data of 2014.
That exceeds average milking capacity of the American cow.
93.31 k a year. And the European cow. 61.39 k according to 2009. The record annual yield of milk in Israel makes L a year at the fat content of 5%.
Despite the ban on pork in Judaism and Islam, two religions prevailing in Israel, in the country there is a pig breeding commercially. Herds of the kibbutzim Mizra and Lakov contained at the beginning of the 2010 years on 10,000 heads everyone.
Important part of economy of Israel is made by tourism.
About 195,000 people minus 6% of total number employed are engaged in travel business of Israel. At the beginning of the 21st century in the sphere of tourism and recreational services about 3% of GDP of Israel were created.
As the main components of the international tourism in Israel visit of relatives. About a third of all visits to Israel. Rest and visit of sites, a pilgrimage, business tourism and treatment act. It is especially popular among foreign tourists. Jerusalem, which is visited by 75% of the total number of visitors, considerable interest medical sources of the Dead Sea and Tiberias Lake attract.
At the same time remaining not settled, the Arab-Israeli conflict acts as the factor containing growth of the international tourism.
By data for 2017, Israel 3.6 million tourists, and taking into account one-day visits, more than 3.8 million. Visited, including nearly 780,000 from the USA, more than 300,000 from Russia and France and more than 200,000 from Germany. Tourism revenues were 20 billion shekels. At the same time, the comparable number of citizens of Israel annually goes abroad. Total length of the railroads for 2017 is 1250 km. Track width minus 1435 m. Extent of highways minus km. All with a hard coating. From them 449 km freeways. The movement on highways right hand and on the railroad left side. Result of strong British influence at the end of 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. In 2013 in the country there were 47 airports, from them 29 with a hard coating and 18 with soil landing strips and also 3 helicopter aerodromes. The international flights except 4 airports. the airport of David Ben Gurion, the airport of Eilat, the airport in Ovda, and Haifa.
The largest airline of Israel is founded in 1948, Al Zail. Total length of gas pipelines -763 km.
Oil pipelines -442 km. 4 main seaports are located in Ashdod, Hadera, Eilat and Haifa. Since 2007 in Haifa, the first private port in the country works. Buses for the beginning of the 21st century remain a main type of public transport of Israel. Bus lines connect practically all settlements. The largest bus company of Israel, Egypt, in 2001 was the second largest in the world, at the time serving 70% of a bus passenger traffic of the country. In 2011 in Jerusalem, the Israel's first high-speed tram system is open. In Haifa since August 2013, the network of Metronet buses, including 3 routes and connecting Haifa to northern suburbs, works. In the same place, the underground Carmelite funicular recorded in the Guinness Book of Records as the shortest operating underground system in the world works. The easily rail transport system of Tel Aviv, according to plans, has to begin work in 2021. The Ministry of Communications of Israel is the regulator of activity of all organizations working in the sphere of communication.
Distribution of the IP addresses, service of the domain,
LNOs and many other things are carried out by the Israeli Internet Association. The bulk of services of wire communication in Israel in 2016 was provided by 2 companies, Bezeq and Hot Telecommunications Systems. Mobile services -5 companies. As of 2017, in the country there were 10.54 million subscribers of cellular communication, 1.27 subscribers on each resident of Israel, and 3.24 million subscribers of wire telephone communication. All phone numbers in Israel 7-digit, preceded by the local code. 02 Jerusalem, 04 Haifa, 09 Sharon, etc. Are the code of cellular communication. 050, 052, etc.
In Israel there is a developed industry, and his population is considered one of the most technologically competent in the world.
In 2008, Israel took the 2nd place in the world by the number of computers with internet connection per capita. For 2014, the number of internet subscribers was estimated approximately at 2 million, and number of users at 5.6 million people. Speed of internet navigation was, on average, 40 m. In each family there were, on average, 5 devices connected to the internet. 45% of users stored audio and video files on external servers.
To the middle of 2017, the number of internet users in the country was estimated at 6.6 million people, or 80% of the general population of Israel.
The mail service in Israel is carried out by the state company, Dor Israel. Mail of Israel. In March 2006, post management at the Ministry of Communications, Rishut Hador, was transformed to the state company. And also the private post agencies and the express companies. The state monopoly for Massachusetts mailing was liquidated in 2007 within post reform, but Dor Israel controls also after that the most part of the market of post services.
Transfer to self-sufficiency led to staff reductions and the general deterioration in work of the company, and in 2018 the project of her partial privatization was published. Israel is a member of the WTO and also has free trade agreements with the EU and the USA.
It compensates lack of access to many Middle Eastern markets. The main problem of the Israeli economy many years is the negative balance of trade balance. Export from 1998 years is highly diversified. According to the World Factbook, the external debt of Israel for the end of 2017 exceeded $88 billion. Gold and exchange stocks of the country for the same date estimated made $113 billion. The trade in securities in Tel Aviv began in 1935, to the basis of the State of Israel the first.
And as of the 2010 years only.
The platform on trade in securities in Israel, Tel Avivsky Stock Exchange, is created in 1953. The credit banking system is headed by the Bank of Israel, founded in 1954. In the late 90s the government carried out privatization of three largest banks of the country.
Leumi Bank LeIsrael, Apollim Bank and Discount Bank of LeIsrael.
As of 2008, in Israel there is a set of commercial banks, both local and branches foreign. Mortgage and investment. The banking system is characterized by the high level of specialization.
According to Bank of Israel, in the territory of the country representative offices of foreign banks and financial groups officially conduct the activity.
Some of them have the status of full-fledged banks and provide to clients the complete list of banking services. Others have the status commercial, industrial or investment, therefore the list of their services narrow purpose.
Currency of the State of Israel since 1985 is the Israeli new shekel.
Shekel, L. Symbols. NIS, according to the nomenclature of ISO -4217 ILS. The new shekel is hard currency since January 1, 2003. Since May 26, 2008 the Israeli new shekel, along with several other hard currencies, is used when calculating in the International Interbank CN system. The sum of cash in circulation in Israel for the end of 2017 was about 82 billion shekels. Use of credit cards, both international and local. The credit company Issercard, not accepted abroad or at payment in online stores. About 500,000 such cards are issued. Is widespread. The Bank of Israel, within compliance to the international standards of safety, obliged all businesses in the country since 2019 to use the terminals capable to read out M-chips. The largest volume of export of the Israeli products goes to the USA. 28.8% by assessment for 2017. Hong Kong. 7%. People's Republic of China. 5.4%. And Belgium. 4.5%. The leading importers of goods to Israel is the USA. 11.7% by assessment for 2017. The People's Republic of China. 9.5%. Switzerland. 8%. And Germany. 8%. The share of Great Britain and Belgium in the total amount of the import going to Israel makes approximately 6%. In general, for 2017, the cost of the imported goods and services was $66.76 billion. Export in a year was estimated at $64.54 billion before. The main components of the Israeli export are machinery and equipment, the software, diamonds and chemicals. One of the biggest income items of Israel is made by export of weapon and the defensive equipment. According to the Stockholm Institute of a Research of Problems of the World, SERP, for 2017 this country was included into the 5 of the largest exporters of arms in the world, after the USA, Russia, France and Germany. The main components of import of Israel are raw materials, fuel, agricultural products. In particular, grain, the rough diamonds and weapon. Israel, being one of the main exporters of arms, at the same time is among also the main importers, taking the 18th place in the world as of 2017. Weapon arrives from 4 main sources: the USA, Canada, Germany and Italy. The Israel Defense Forces. Israel Defense Forces consist of ground forces, the navies, and the Air Force, AF. They were formed in 1948 during the War of Independence of the quasi-military organizations, mainly of Haganah, which education preceded Declaration of Independence. The Israel Defense Forces also use information of Service of Military Investigation, Amen, which works in interaction with Mossad and Armed Forces of Israel are considered as one of the best in the world, both on level of training of employees and on technical equipment. Most of Israelis are called up for military service at the age of 18 years. Men served 3 years. Since 2020 in non-combat parts -2.5 years. And women 2. Upon termination of conscription service, the Israeli men pass into a stock and pass till several weeks of reservistski collecting. We pardon. Every year before achievement of 40 years. For separate ranks and specialties, the maximum age of passing we pardon reaches 42 and 49 years. Most of women are exempted from reserve service. The Israeli Muslims, except Druzes, Christians and pupils of yeshivas, the Jewish religious educational institutions, are exempted from military service. Attempts to abolish these privileges are made long time. As of 2015, about 1,700 Muslim volunteers, generally from among Bedouins, served in Israel Defense Forces. The citizens exempted from military service can pass Sherat Leumi, alternative service. Volunteers in hospitals, schools and other objects of social security.
At a full appeal of reservists, the staff of the Israeli armed forces can reach 800,000 people, that is comparable to the number of armies of the neighboring Arab states, and the armored equipment Israel outnumbers all European countries of NATO.
From the moment of declaration of independence, Israel spends a considerable part of GDP for defense. For example, in 1984 such expenses made 24% of VVV. By 2016 this share decreased to 5.64%, however in comparison with the European countries still remain big. On this indicator, Israel took in the world the place in the top 10, on an equal basis with the UN above Russia. The Israeli army is armed with generally high-tech arms manufactured both in Israel and in other countries. The USA are the most important foreign sponsor of the Israel Defense Forces. So, for a decade from 2019 to 2028, the planned American military aid to Israel will make $38 billion. Israeli-American development Hetz rocket. Arrow is one of the few anti-ballistic systems of this sort. Since War of the Doomsday, Israel develops own system of spy satellites. Success of the OFAC program allowed Israel to launch independently satellites. In Israel, own fighting Merkava tanks are issued. Chariot. Besides, Israel is one of world leaders in pilotless military aircraft and is among the leading exporters of arms.
Israel didn't sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and pursues uncertainty policy concerning possession of nuclear warheads.
According to experts of the Stockholm Institute of a Research of Problems of the World, in 2017 Israel had about 80 warheads. By other estimates, the number of warheads are more, up to 200 or even 400. Specialists in arms consider that Israel possesses a full nuclear triad for delivery of warheads to the purpose. The Israeli police are under jurisdiction of the Ministry of Internal Security. For communication with police in Israel, it is necessary to gather 100 from any phone number. The Israeli police, the professional organization in 2014 totaling employees. From them about 800 boundary police of Magav. Besides, her work is helped by volunteers of civil team. Mishmer Izraki.
Besides Magav, the structure of police includes the Counterterrorist Division Two Holes founded in 1974.
His tasks include prevention of terrorist attacks, taking of terrorists and release of hostages. Treat the system of security services of Israel. Shabak. Shin Bet. Sherek Bitakan Klali, Shabak. The General Security Service of Israel, Amen. Military Intelligence of Israel and Mossad. Homosad Lamodin of Atlatafkadim Makadi.
Department of Investigation and Special Tasks, Political Intelligence of Israel.
Shabak is engaged in counterintelligence activities and is responsible for internal security. His tasks include counteraction to espionage, disclosure of the state secret, to terrorism and political subversive activities. Protection of the Prime Minister of Israel and other members of the government, objects of defense industry, a subvenster of Israel abroad is assigned to Shabak.
He also exercises the general control of safety of national airline Al Zail. Aman, as governing body of military investigation in Israel Defense Forces, is engaged in aero-air and radio-electronic air reconnaissance, collects information by means of military attaches in the different countries and the special purpose divisions operating in the back of the opponent.
Aman is responsible for preparation of daily national briefings for the Prime Minister and the government, case studies on the neighboring Arab countries, makes assessment of probability of the beginning of military operations. Mossad, Foreign Intelligence Service. Mossad collects also the analysis of prospecting information and also secret special operations outside Israel.
One of differences Mossad from similar intelligence services of other countries consists in small number of the organization, only 1,200 permanent members of staff, including technicians.
In Israel there is a developed state system of medical institutions which guarantees equal opportunities on receiving medical services by all citizens. This right is affirmed in the law existing since 1995. Providing medical services is carried out with an obligatory medical insurance. The amount of an insurance premium is defined depending on the amount of income. There are also private clinics.
Under the supervision of the state, 4 private health insurance funds are engaged in insurance of the population.
Clalit, Luyimit, Moifedit and Maccabi. Additional private medical insurance obligatory isn't. The package of the insured services doesn't include psychological and narcological support, cosmetic operations, participation in purchase of points and operations abroad. In expanded option, the basket of the insured services since 2013 can join the dental help. In Israel there are 2 types of ambulance cars.
The white ambulance is intended for delivery in medical institutions of the patients with diseases and injuries of moderate severity who aren't demanding special treatment on the way.
In such ambulance there is a driver paramedic. And, as a rule, the volunteer. Orange resuscitation crews. Nathan. Consist of doctors. The decision on the direction of one of 2 crews is made by the dispatcher of service of ambulance.
In Israel, the dispatching service of ambulance is caused by number 101 or from the cell phone of all operators by number 112.
According to TS of Israel, in 2016 the country took the 11th place in the world on the expected life expectancy. The 8th from 2010 to 2013. Average life expectancy made 82.5 years. Women have 84.2 years and 80.7 at men. On such new indicator as the expected duration of healthy life, Israelis advanced the Central European indicators for 3, 4. 65.1, 61.8 years at women mind and 65.4 mind 61.4 at men. Since 1970 the expected life expectancy in Israel grew for 10.3 at an average value on the odd in 10 years. Other indicators: population percent with an excess weight 53%, and obesity 17%. A share of smokers among adult population 19.4%. Mortality in the first 30 days after a stroke 6.8%. In Israel were similar to average figures in the OD, and alcohol consumption is significantly lower. 2.6 al per capita in a year mind. Frequency of hospitalization with respiratory diseases and heart failure decreases, but remains higher than on average in the OD countries, whereas the frequency of hospitalization with diabetes below. Israel on the 6th place from 37. Child mortality in Israel, one of the lowest in the world. According to the World Factbook, in 2017 Israel was 3. 4 death on 1,000 newborns took the 204th place from 225 countries. At the same time, however, according to 2008-2011 infantile mortality among the Arab population, 6.78 on 1,000 newborns, remains much higher than among other ethnic groups, 2.72. From 1981 to 2010 in Israel, about 6,600 patients with AIDS and HIV-positive people were registered. The quantity of new cases on population in 2010 was 5.6, in comparison with 3.6 in 1986. More than 40% of this number were made by visitors from the countries with high percent of defeat by an infection, as repatriates, mainly of Ethiopia, and migrant workers. Homosexual men and consumers of injecting drugs were other groups of the increased risk. By 2016, the number of the registered cases exceeded 9,100. At the same time, since 2013, gain infected annually decreased. It was reported about successful clinical tests of experimental medicine for AIDS known as Gomorrah. Main articles: Ministry of Social Welfare of Israel and Institute of National Insurance of Israel.
Social Security of the population in Israel is assigned to the Ministry of Social Welfare of Israel and Institute of National Insurance of Israel, accountable to him.
The law on national insurance obliges the residents of Israel who reached 18 years to pay contributions to the system of national insurance. Regular payment of insurance premiums grants the right to various grants. On providing a living wage, grant to a case of temporary loss of work, a grant on an old age, grants to the birth and education of children. In 2014, expenses for education made 5.7% of GDP of Israel. The main regulating documents in this area are the Law on Compulsory Education and the Law on the State Education, adopted, respectively, in 1949 and 1953. The State Education Act, adopted in 1953, founded 5 types of schools: the public secular, public religious, ultra-Orthodox, communal schools in settlements, and the Arab schools. The public secular schools, the biggest group of schools, are visited by most of the Jewish and other non-Arab peoples in Israel. Education in Israel is obligatory for children from 3 to 18 years. School education is divided into 3 steps. Elementary school, 1-6 classes. Intermediate school, 7-9 classes. High school, 10-12 classes. The last class comes to an end with obtaining the school leaving certificate, Bagnet, which gives the chance of receipt in higher educational institutions. For obtaining the certificate, knowledge of the main objects, mathematics, the Tanakh, Hebrew, the Israeli and general literature, English, history and social science is obligatory. At Muslim, Christian and Druze schools, examination in knowledge of the Torah is replaced with examination in Islam, Christianity or Druze heritage. In 2015, examinations for the Israeli school leaving certificate were successfully passed by 52.7% of pupils of graduation classes. On average, the Israeli children get more years educations than children in other countries of Southwest Asia, and share with Japanese the second place in Asia, conceding only to children of South Korea.
However, as shows a research of 2017, training duration in Israel doesn't affect positively labor productivity, which for this moment was one of the lowest among the developed countries. My assessment for 2011, among Israelis at the age of 15 years the level of literacy is also more senior. I was 97.8%. The Israeli universities and most the colleges operating in the country are subsidized with the state.
The Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the oldest university of Israel, the location of the Jewish National and University Library, the world's largest storage of books on the Jewish subject. In 2018, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem got to the first 100 higher education institutions of the world according to the Shanghai Academic Rating, having taken in the 95th place. Except for 2017, the Jewish University is included into the first 100 this rating annually since 2003. Among 100 best world higher education institutions also leading technical college of the country, the Haifa Technion. The 77th position. Other universities of the country. Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan University, Ramat Gan. The Haifa University, the owner of the biggest library in the Middle East. Ben Gurion University of the Negev, Beersheba, Weizmann Institute of Science, Arielski University, Open University of Israel. Correspondence. In 2012, according to the report of ODE, Israel was the fourth in the list of the most educated countries of the world, conceding only to Russia. Canada and Japan, more than 46% of its inhabitants had the higher or secondary vocational education.
By 2017, the share of residents of Israel with the higher or secondary vocational education reached 49.9%.
Israel is high on the list in the world on development of high technologies, and at the beginning of the 2010 years had the highest number of the high-tech companies and startups per capita. Possessing poor water resources, Israel has developed water conservation technologies. It is also one of leaders in use of solar energy per capita. From 2002 to 2013, 8 citizens of Israel became Nobel Prize laureates in scientific disciplines.
Israel is among world leaders in the number of scientists and engineers, scientific publications and the registered patents per capita, and also on DDD share in investments into research and development.
In 1981, the Israeli military intelligence of Oman allocated $5 million for researches in the field of creation of spacecrafts and carrier rockets. The same year, the Prime Minister began authorized creation of the space program of Israel, and in 1983 the Israeli Space Agency, which was headed by the scientist-physicist Yuval Ne'eman, was created. On September 19, 1988, Israel launched the first OFAC-1 satellite from the Palmachim spaceport. Having used the three-stage carrier rocket Shavit of own development. OFAC-3, started in 1995, became the first prospecting artificial satellite of Israel. OFAC-5, OFAC-7 and OFAC-9 spy satellites were launched later.
The devices of remote sensing of Earth, ERAS, developed on the basis of the OFAC program at the same time are used by the Defense Ministry of Israel and supply qualitative data to the international market of geospatial data.
Series of the Israeli communication satellites AMIS. Afro-Mediterranean Orbital System was developed by the local company Israel Aerospace Industries. except for the sixth satellite of a series developed in Russia. Satellites which creation was partially financed by the state. The share of the state investments isn't disclosed. Are operated by the Spacecom company which is deployed in Ramat Gan. The first satellite of a series created with the assistance of the French and German experts is operated since 1996. While Opheka continued to be put to orbit by the Israeli rockets from the Israeli ground Palmachim, satellites of other series were put to orbit by means of foreign carrier rockets and from the foreign spaceports. For example, the first two satellites of the ERS series were launched in 2000 and 2006 from the Svobodny spaceport by means of the carrier rocket Start-1. Ilan Ramon, who in 2003 was the crew member of the lost Columbia shuttle, remains the only Israeli who visited space.
The possibility of inclusion of Israelis in the structure of the international space crews is considered by Haka.
With the Israeli Atomic Power Commission, IAP,
created in 1952, deals with issues of the nuclear program of Israel. Nuclear scientists from Israel participated in works on creation of the French nuclear weapon, and in the 1968 years within this cooperation the French side constructed in Negev near Dimona the nuclear research center, at the heart of which worked the heavy water nuclear reactor. One more nuclear research center, which is based around the light water reactor, was constructed in the 1958 years by the American experts within the Atom for the World program. A part of atomic objects of Israel isn't under control of IAEA, as Israel didn't join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Power of the light water reactor Nakel Sorik -5 MUM, the heavy water reactor in Dimona approximately from 75 to 150 MUM. In 2011 it was reported about construction plans in the south of Israel to the 1200 MUM full-fledged NPP, providing up to 10% of need of the country for the electric power.
The Israeli cultural diversity is based on variety of the Israeli society. Jews from around the world brought cultural and religious traditions, having created, thereby, a melting copper of the Jewish traditions and beliefs. The most significant Israeli minority, Arabs, also left a print in the culture of the country, in particular, in such spheres as architecture, music and kitchen. In the territory of Israel, including controlled territories, there are 10 objects entered in the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage List. Sina Dizengoff Square, a part of a complex of the White City of Tel Aviv. Old City of Jerusalem and its walls, 1981. Nassad's Fortress, 2001. Old part of Acre, 2001. The White City in Tel Aviv, in style Bauhaus, 2003. Bible Tel Megiddo Hatzer Beersheba, 2005. Way of Aromas, Ruins of the Cities of the Desert in Negev, 2005. The Bohé Gardens in Haifa and Acre, 2008. Anthropogenesis Monuments at Mount Carmel, 2012. Maresh's Caves and Beit Gavrina N in the Judaic Valley, 2014. Necropolis Beit Shirim, 2015. Within the mandate on management of Palestine received by Great Britain from the League of Nations in 1922 as official languages in the mandated territory, English, Arab and Hebrew were approved. The language policy of the mandatory authorities was much less resolute than in traditional British colonies. Everyday life didn't demand knowledge of English from residents of Palestine. The exception was made by the people holding official posts or serving in armed forces. At the Arab and Jewish schools of Palestine, teaching in the corresponding languages was encouraged. English was entered as an obligatory subject only from the 5th class. After creation of the State of Israel, English lost the status official, though kept a part of formal functions. So, even in the 21st century, an inscription on banknotes and stamps of Israel are duplicated in this language, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Israel publishes English translation of all adopted laws. Hebrew became the first state language of Israel, and Arab the second. Nevertheless, in practice the statuses of these two languages weren't equal. The special judgment was often required to enter records on Arab on road signs and names of streets. The addresses on forms of the private companies and public institutions were often printed only in Hebrew and English. Since 2018, the Basic Law Israel, the national state of the Jewish people, proclaims a state language only Hebrew, but speaks about the special status of Arabic. At the same time, Israel, the country of immigrants, and, as a result of it, the multilingual state.
Large-scale repatriation of the 1,998 years from the countries of the former also resulted in bigger tolerance in the language policy of Israel, which is expressed in existence of numerous periodicals in Russian. After Massachusetts' arrival to the country of the Ethiopian Jews with assistance of the Ministry of Education, with a frequency of times of 1 and 2 months, 2 newspapers in America issued.
The State of Israel was founded, first of all, as the national center for all Jewish people and is defined in the Declaration of Independence as the Jewish state.
The law on return of the State of Israel grants the right to all Jews and also the people having the Jewish origin to obtain citizenship of the country.
A provision that Israel, the national state of the Jewish people, repeats also in the Basic Law of the same name adopted in 2017. At the same time, Israel, the democratic state where under the law the equal rights with Jews have both all other religious and ethnic groups.
According to TS of Israel, for the end of 2017 of 74.5% of citizens of the country, 17.75% Muslims, 1.95% Christians and
1.6% Druzes were written down as Jews. For 4.2% of the population, denomination wasn't defined. According to poll of 2009, among the Jewish population of Israel, 22% defined themselves as Orthodox Jews, 32% as the observing traditions, and 46% considered themselves secular, including 3% anti-religious.
Muslims are the most numerous religious minority in Israel, about
1.5 million in the middle of the 2010 years, nearly 70% from them in the north of the country. In Galilee and Haifa, Muslims, mainly Sunnites, are most of the Israeli Arabs. The Muslim population of the country grew almost by 10 times from the moment of declaration of the State of Israel. In Israel, over 400 mosques, including more than 70 in Jerusalem, work. About 300 imams and muezzins get paid from the state. Christians in Israel too are represented generally by Arabs. About 60% of the Israeli Christians in the middle of the 2010 years were parishioners of Melkitsky Greco-Catholic Church, another 30% Orthodox Christians. Other faiths include Catholics of the Roman ceremony, Maronites, believers of the Armenian Apostolic Church and others. The number of so-called Messianic Jews, 9-12,000 for 2005, quickly grows. Some part of Christians, the non-Jews who arrived as dicks of families of Jews, however most of such citizens is written down in category, without religious affiliation. Representatives of other religious groups, including Buddhists and Hindus, are also present at Israel, though at small amounts. Though the spiritual center of religion of Abakha, the residence of her World House of Justice and a tomb of founders are located in the north of Israel, in the Holy Land there was no constant Baha'i community, and this belief is presented in Israel only by staff of volunteers and pilgrims.
Israel is a religiously divided society. Religious and secular groups form the certain social worlds with very small amount of close friends and mixed marriages outside the group.
Poll of 2014-2015 showed that the vast majority of the believing Jews, Muslims, Christians and Druzes close friends, as a rule, belong to their own religious community.
Almost all Jews, Muslims, Christians and Druzes marry or in an illegitimate relationship with representatives of the religious group.
Internal groups of the Israeli Jewry are isolated from each other on religious sign too, so, at 95% the Haredi Jew of spouses is also an ultra-Orthodox, and 93% of not religious Jews have not religious spouse/partner. Besides belief of Abakha in Israel, the key holy sites of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam are located. The main shrine of Judaism is the Temple Mount located in Jerusalem. The great ceremonial value was gained by the Wailing Wall adjoining to her. For Jews, the Cave of Patriarchs in Hebron, Racheli's tomb near Bethlehem, graves of religious teachers in Galilee have the cult status. For Christians, the places connected with events of the New Testament, the alleged birthplace of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem, the Temple of the Lord's Coffin in Jerusalem, the Annunciation Basilica in Nazareth, separate objects in Jericho and on the Genesaretsky Lake are sacred.
The sanctity of Jerusalem for Muslims is connected with the story about a wonderful travel of the Prophet Muhammad to the At-Talayanish Mosque and his inhabiting.
The majority of shrines of Islam in Israel and on the West Bank coincide with the places esteemed by Jews and Christians. Basic law.
Israel, the national state of the Jewish people, fixes in Israel the official status behind the Jewish calendar, which isn't coinciding on duration of calendar year with Gregorian. According to this calendar, the Sabbath has the status of holiday. The same calendar serves for definition of dates religious and a considerable part of not religious public holidays and memorable days,
including the Independence Day, Day of Accident and Day of Remembrance. Behind religious minorities, the right for the weekend and dates of their own religious holidays remains. Since 1998 in Israel, the law obliging public institutions to specify in documents date of both the Jewish and Gregorian calendar works. stipulating that the first case doesn't extend to settlements with most of the non-Jewish population and educational institutions with teaching not in Hebrew.
And identity cards of Israelis' dates of birth are specified in both systems of chronology, Gregorian and Jewish. Owing to a big share in the population of Israel of repatriates from the countries of the former USSR as a public holiday in 2017, the Victory Day celebrated not on Jewish, and on a Gregorian calendar is approved on May 9.
Holidays.
At the state level in Israel, mainly traditional Judaic holidays and posts, and also the days connected with the history of the State of Israel. Day of Accident and the Heroism, Day of Remembrance which fell in wars of Israel, the Independence Day and Day of Jerusalem
are celebrated. In total in Israel also 4 secular holidays are celebrated, 12 religious, including the Sabbath. All of them proceed from calling before calling, and dates of their carrying out are determined by the Jewish lunar calendar. In this regard, every year public holidays in Israel fall on different dates of the civil Gregorian calendar. Literature of Israel is generally poetry and prose in Hebrew. A small part of books appears in other languages, such as Arab, Yiddish and Russian. Under the law, 2 copies of all printing editions in Israel have to be sent to the Jewish National and University Library of the Jewish University. Since 2008, National Library of Israel. Since 2001, this law extends also to copies, audio and videos and other formats of the edition. The most famous authors of literary works in Hebrew, the poet Chaim Nachman Baulik, the Nobel Prize laureate on literature Shai Agnon, and from writers of the next generations, Hanoch Bartov, Moshe Shamir, novelists Aleph Bet Aikosher and Amos Oz. Among the famous Israeli authors in other languages, Emil Habibi, Arab, Velvel Chernin, Yiddish, Igor Guberman, Dina Rubina, Anna Gorenko, Russian. Since 2000, the program of public schools joins works by the Israeli Arab authors. Every 2 years in Jerusalem there takes place the International Book Fair. In addition, annually there passes Week of the Ivritsky Book. Since 2000, within a week of the Ivritsky Book, the main Israeli literary award, the Award Sapira, is presented. Israel found in niches traditional Jewish music, including Synagogalny, Hasidic and klezmersky, and music of the countries of an outcome, and modern genres in particular, jazz and fate. An important role in popular music of the first years of statehood was played by so-called Songs of Earth of Israel, and later, with strengthening in the local culture of traditions of East communities, Mizrach style in a platform and ethnic fate.
In Israel, the network of music schools and academies is developed. In a number of higher education institutions, departments of musicology work. Not only in the country, but also in the world, the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, created in 1936, uses broad popularity.
Since 1973, Israel participates nearly in every year in a song contest, Eurovision. The Israeli singers won this competition 4 times, and in 2019 Israel for the 3rd time acted as the country organizer. The Festival of Israel and a Festival of Chamber Music in Jerusalem, the Jazz on the Red Sea Festival and a Festival of Classical Music in Eilat, a Festival of Klezmersky Music in Tzfat and a Festival of Liturgical Music are regularly held to Abu Gosha. near Jerusalem. Amateur theatre companies arose in Palestine at the end of the 19th century. In 1920, the first professional troupe, Ivrytsky Theatre on the Earth of Israel, existed till 1927. Is created, and since 1932 in Palestine the Gebima Theatre works at a constant basis. After creation of Israel of Gabim and other repertoire theatres are subsidized by the state and city councils. Broad, including international fame, was gained by choreographic collectives of Israel, among which troupe, Bathsheba, Inbal and Bat Dor. Though the first cinema experiences in Palestine are dated back already to the beginning of the 20th centuries, they long remained irregular, and only since the 1960s professional directors, Menahem Golan, Ephraim Kishin, Yuri Azor and others, provided transition to new qualitative level. Since 1967, under the auspices of the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the center of the Israeli movie works. From 1970th years the Israeli cinematographers began to receive awards at the international film festivals. Own international festivals take place in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and Haifa. Opening in 1906 in Jerusalem of School of Arts and Crafts. Subsequently Academy of Arts. Betzalel became an important step in development of the fine arts in the Jewish Ishuv. In architecture of an Ishuv, imitations Eastern medieval style originally dominated, but modern materials and experience of the latest Western architectural schools, including Bauhaus and functionalism, were adopted further. In these styles general building of Tel Aviv and Technion in Haifa was carried out. After the basis of Israel in such famous foreign architects as Oscar Niemeyer, the main building of the Haifa University, and Philip Johnson worked.
At the end of the 20th century, the noticeable mark in the Israeli architecture was left by the postmodernist Moshe Safdie and David Reznik.
In 1934 the Association of Painters and Sculptors in Eretz Israel is created. Further the Union of Artists of Israel. Besides Betzalel Academy, schools in Tel Aviv and Beersheba give art education. Professional architects are trained by mainly Haifa Technion. In the first decade of the 21st century in Israel about 150 museums worked, first of which it was opened in 1906 at Betzalel School. In comparison with any other country of Israel has the most large number of the museums per capita.
The Museum of Israel in Jerusalem is one of the most important cultural institutes of the country and the place of storage of rolls of the Dead Sea, and also a huge collection of Jewish sciences and the European art.
The Museum of the Holocaust, Yad Vashem, the world's largest archive of the printing, photo and film materials devoted to the scary page in world history.
The Museum of Diaspora in the campus of Tel Aviv University, the interactive museum devoted to history of the Jewish communities of the whole world.
Rich collections of the fine arts of the general or thematic contents, the Tel Avivsky Museum of Fine Arts, the Haifa Art Museum and the Museum of the Japanese Art of Tikitin, Athalir with him, and also Negev's Museum in Beersheba Haf.
Also the Rural Museum, which opened in 1938 in the Kibbutz Ein Herod, the first in the country, nowadays considered as the largest in the north of Israel, is art.
The Israeli press and broadcasting companies differ in a variety of political, religious and economic views and the used languages. The majority of large newspapers were based even before declaration of the state. For example, Haaretz was founded in 1919, Jerusalem Post in 1932, Leaves in English, and Idiot Akronot in 1939. These newspapers remain popular also in the 21st century.
The Daily Hebrew speaking newspaper Mariv, created in 1948, and the Free Hebrew speaking newspaper Israel Hayom, founded in 2007, which became the most widespread daily newspaper of the country in the middle of 2010, also belong to the largest editions.
In the 21st century in Israel, over 1,000 periodicals, most of which is available on the internet, are issued. The most part of newspapers appears in Hebrew and Arab. There is also sectoral press, in particular, in such languages as Russian, German and Yiddish. The television in Israel appeared in the late 60s, since the end of 1969 of broadcast of the public TV channel. At the time The Only Thing became daily, and in 1981 Caller.
Public channels broadcast under control of the Israeli management of TV and radio broadcasting up to 2017, when he was replaced by the Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation.
The channel Commercial TV channel in Israel began work in 1994. In the 21st century, most of the Israeli families have a subscription to cable or satellite packages of TV channels. The Anegosishnost characteristic of the Israeli media is present and here. For example, in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, the basic package of the cable company of Jotas included channels in 12 languages. Since November 2002, I was among the central Israeli channels also Russian-speaking. In the 21st century, the Kol Israel radio station conducts broadcasting on 8 thematic channels, carrying out also foreign broadcasting. Transfers are conducted in 17 languages. Besides Kol Israel, in Israel 2 radio stations operated by Kalia Israel Defense Forces and Galgalatz, and more than 10 private stations work. In 2017, Reporters Without Borders organization,
Reporters Sans Frontières,
ROSF, specified in the report that the Israeli journalists use freedom, rare in the Middle East, openly to express the opinion. In 2005, this organization described the Israeli media as traditionally strong and independent, nevertheless having put Israel only on the 67th place in the rating of freedom of world media. The main claim concerned intervention of the Defense Ministry in activity of media, in particular in occupied territories.
Historically, in the Jewish culture, the sport and physical development weren't put on the first place, and honoring by ancient Greeks of athletic skill was considered as undesirable penetration of the Hellenistic values on the Jewish Wednesday. The relation of Jews to sport began to change only in the 19th century, when this type of occupations began to win popularity in the countries of dispersion.
I promoted it as well. Promotion of physical culture of Max Nordau. At the beginning of the 20th century, the chief rabbi of Palestine and -1 proclaimed that the body serves soul, and only a sound body can guarantee healthy soul. Maccabiansky Games, Maccabiada, for the Jewish athletes were for the first time held in the 1930th years, and since then their pass each 4 years. Today the most popular sports among the Israeli audience are the soccer and basketball. In 1964 Israel received the Cup of Asia on soccer and won these competitions. The Maccabi Basketball Club, Tel Aviv, won the Cup of the European Champions, nowadays EuroLeague. 6 times and 9 times was a finalist. Also won Jerusalem Hapoel at men the European club basketball tournaments and Elitzer from Ramla at women. Also chess is developed in Israel. Israel twice in 1964 and 1976 hosted the Chess Olympiads. The Olympic Games of 1976 were boycotted by the countries of a socialist camp and a number of developing countries. The women's tournament in the Olympic Games of 1976 was won by the Israeli national team headed by Alla Kushner, and the men's national team of Israel took the second place at the Olympic Games of 2008 in Dresden, in 2 years having won bronze medals. After arrival of a large number of players from the former Usr Beer Sheba became the chess center of the country. The city hosted the International Team Championship on chess in 2005. The native of Minsk Boris Gelfand living in Rishon divided the second and third places in the World Cup of 2007, and in 2012 after the victory played a match for a rank of the world champion in a tournament of applicants, having conceded in him on a tiebreak to Vishen Anatonovich. The Israeli Grandmaster Emil Satovsky became in 2001 the champion of Europe. Israel participates in the Olympic Games since 1952. Capture and death of 11 athletes at the Olympic Games of 1972 in Munich became a tragic event in his sports history. Israelis won the first medals of the Olympic Games in 1992 in Barcelona. Since then the Israeli athletes became the Olympic prize winners of 6 times, having won in total 9 medals, including 1 gold. In sailing, Gal Friedman. The Israeli disabled athletes tried to obtain considerable progress at the Paralympic Games, in particular in 1968 when these competitions were hosted by Israel and the local national team was in the top 3 in an all-team competition. In the first years of existence of the country the Israeli athletes participated in Asian continental competitions, but over time the political situation developed so that Israelis act not in Asia and in Europe. Also far. Write comments. Read comments. Interesting people will tell interesting stories. All of good mood and good luck.